I really don't know what it feels like to ride a wave like that, but I do know what it feels like when everything's going well, when everything I say seems to be received positively, and I seem to get to where I'm going ahead of schedule and all those wonderful, good synchronicity kinds of things. But you know those feelings don't last all that long. It's not long before we start hitting headwinds of one sort or another. And every once in a while there's a seismic event. Even benign forces like gravity, predictable forces, waxing and waning, ebbing and flowing, constant change. That's true in our business. It's true in all the rules. And it's true in this marketplace. Something interesting, though, is that when you float like a cork bobbing on the water, no matter how rough the waves, the cork just kind of rolls around and doesn't really move that far. There's actually 4 layers to this in our marketplace. We have all the windbags at the top of the political class, right? And as we move down closer to where we do business, things actually get calmer. To the point at the bottom where there's a lot of infrastructure. You might call it the bureaucracy. I call it process, systems, that actually make the surface quite calm because there's all that infrastructure under there. I don't know about you, but I was always more successful when I was down there. I'm not a politician, thank God, so I'm more comfortable down there. And what I want to do today, this is an excerpt of our fundamentals class, is give you some fundamental pointers along the way. One of those fundamental pointers is making sure you go to source documents. Anybody here ever take journalism in school classes? Anybody? A couple people? I started out in that world, and what they banged into our heads was primary sources. Go to the source. Don't take anybody else's word for it. Primary sources. And so every slide that references to something in the government, I'm linking to the primary source today. Many of you know that we sold Immix to Arrow, and I've been around doing lots of different things with lots of different companies, and so I honestly hadn't really kept up with what happened in the last couple of years around the rules and some of the initiatives and so on. So this was an opportunity for me to go back and check all the primary sources and update the links and so on. So I'm going to give you that stuff this morning. Structure, how the money flows, IT policy, update, and how all of that works. Again, it's all based on statutory authority implemented in regulation. And then some contracting and acquisition process-oriented content, ending up with government sales processes as a result of all that. So, starting out with how our government is organized, the 3 branches. Congress appropriates, the executive branch spends. So we spend most of our time with the executive branch. But if you want to get the skinny on the organization, the number of agencies in the executive branch, how Congress is organized and where all the references are, or the judicial system and all the courts, those 3 links, that's the source. That's the current place to start. In the executive branch, we have the president's management agenda. Anybody know what law prompted that? If my memory serves me correctly, it was the Government Performance Results Act, GPRA. And so every year, the White House updates its PMA. And the current drivers, and it's all IT-oriented because GPRA was IT-oriented and GPRA's been updated. And I mention this because everything here comes from some kind of legal authority. So GIPRO is one of those authorities that drives a lot of IT procurement. And the president's management agenda is an example of that. A lot of people entering this marketplace, some of you look like you're a little more than just newbies. How many people have been working in this market for more than 5 years? Yeah, so I kind of built this for people who have less than 1 year's experience. How many of those? Oh, okay, good. All right, we're cooking. Okay, good. So many people will say, oh, the government is a vertical. I beg to differ. The government represents missions across every sector, every industry, every activity in our whole economy. And so I think of it as a horizontal with verticals that are reflected in all the other industries that we have in the private sector. So I just want to reference that, and also the list of federal agencies, because it's more than just the CFO agencies. You'll see references to the top 24 agencies that are required to do a lot of special process because they are required by law under the CFO Act to have CFOs. But you go to this site, and you will see that there are many dozens more. And if you get into the FSMA scorecard, which I'll give you a link to, you'll find that many of those agencies, other than the CFO Act's agencies, are where there's a lot of opportunity because they're usually behind. And so they need to catch up. Now, when it comes to actually getting an order out of the government, we have another set of checks and balances. Our three branches of government are a check and balance, co-equal branches with equal amounts of power, providing different pieces of the puzzle. The same thing in procurement. The program managers who have the mission and the budget, Congress gives them money and tells them the amounts they have to perform one activity or another, and there are thousands of these line items just in the world of IT. They can't actually spend that money. They have a bunch of things they have to do to put together a purchase request and justify it and show that they looked around and made good judgment and exercised some form of competition. And then that goes over to finance, who certifies that the purpose of the money that these guys want to spend is actually legit to the accounts that they're referencing, so that everything ties back to that financial authority from Congress. Then and only then does contracts say, okay, we'll get involved and actually obligate the government to pay a bill. Now, in real life, a lot of this happens in parallel. Market research over on the program side, making sure the money's in the right account for the finance people, giving heads up to the contract shop. But these are three very different authorities. And so one of the things we always want to be asking our customer, the person we're working with, is the process rolling on all three tracks? Lest we end up at the end of the month or the end of the quarter or the end of the fiscal year, and whoops, we don't have money. All of this, the great thing about all this is that it's all written down. And it's constantly being updated. So we need to understand the sources of that and stay current. So this process whereby money arrives, anybody who's ever done sales is taught, find the money. Do they have money? There's no reason to spend much time if they don't have money. So we always are asking, do you have budget? Well, words really matter in this market. As you can imagine, everything is a term of art. And so when Congress talks about the budget, most of them are referring to a budget act, which sets the ceilings for the entire federal budget. When it gets down to an agency's quote-unquote budget, it's really an appropriation. 12 different bills that cover all the agencies. Some bills cover multiple agencies. And this is a very timely topic because here we are, the last day of the first continuing resolution, no appropriation. I guess we're bouncing out now to what, December 20? Merry Christmas. We'll see what happens, but without an appropriation of one form or another, whether it's a continuing resolution, an appropriation bill, or an omnibus where they get all rolled up into one bill, or a minibus where there's a couple of multiples of the 12, agencies can't do anything other than protect property and life. Talk a little bit about how this happens. Every year, the White House is tasked, the executive branch, and it comes out of the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the Executive Office of the President, propose a budget to Congress. That process actually begins in the spring. Now is a very good time to be talking to your government customers about what they're going to be proposing in their budget submission for 2021. Believe it or not. Because in May, they're drafting up their IT plans. Because by September, the whole budget for the whole agency has to go to OMB. And then it gets submitted to the Hill in February. Lots of discussion back and forth. Submit the proposed budget to the Hill in February. And the budget that I talked about over there on the right-hand side of the screen, the Budget Act, hopefully those ceilings have been set with the Budget Act so that the Congress can start working on how we're going to divide up the money across all the agencies based on what has been authorized. The National Defense Authorization Act, for example, authorizes activities with ceiling amounts, but the real money, the real authority to spend money is that appropriation, which we don't have yet for 2020. Which is why we're operating under continuing resolution authority. Now, I mentioned that I'm including all these primary sources, and I'm going to break out of this slide and show you the primary source for the appropriation status, because it's timely. People are going to ask you, wow, when's the money, when's the CR, what's happening with appropriations? Well, here is the site where this is all tracked. And on the left-hand column are the 12 different bills and the agencies that are covered by each, and the activity. The House activity, the House has passed most of theirs, I guess all of them, and the Senate is stuck on most of them. All right, but when the Senate finally decides to either approve the House or get together in conference and get agreement between the House and the Senate side, and it moves on to the President for signature, we'll have appropriation. All the agencies will have appropriation authority, which means they have the authority to request funds from Treasury and obligate those funds against a contract action. So I just want you to see that, because this is your primary source. Yeah.
We can't see.
Oh. Oh. Oh, well, I guess this doesn't work. You'll just have to trust me that it goes to the table. Yeah. Sorry about that. Thanks for calling that to my attention. I won't do that again. Okay. So, 12 appropriation bills, the fiscal year. Planning is supposed to happen in the year before the agencies get authority to spend, which is why we need to be understanding what programs are already in place and sell to those. And that's going to get us to the IT dashboard here in a minute. But before I get there, I want to make sure you're up to speed on all the terminology associated with this money authority process. Congress has to authorize an activity first before then a different bill gets passed to appropriate, give the agency the authority to actually spend money against that authorized activity. And then a program manager doesn't automatically get the money, has to request those funds from Treasury based on their appropriation authority, so that then that money gets credited to a treasury account. That's called the apportionment process. And once it's in the account, it's been apportioned, then the controller can approve that purchase request. Remember that purchase request that came from programs through finance on over to contracts? Approves that, signs off on that account number. Any of you have gotten government orders, you know down there in block, I think is it 25, where you get that account number? That's what we're talking about. So that contracting officer can then obligate the funds against that account, against a contract. And then ultimately, the payment office makes the payment. But these are all precisely defined terms, terms of art, legal terms, and it's all in the A11 circular, which I provided a link to on the last page, in the prior page. This is the process, and these are all the terms. I call this the fundamentals class because to me, the fundamentals are getting the terminology right. So that and knowing where the sources are, so that as your career grows, you have a place to put all the information that you read about and you hear about. And we talk about the money as it pertains to IT. It's just a fraction of the overall 4.1 or 2 trillion federal budget. Last year it was 88 billion. And the place to go to get the down and dirty, agency by agency, IT program by IT program, is the IT dashboard. I won't make the mistake of punching out to that. But that is the data source. There's a lot more data in the system that drives the dashboard, OMB Max, than we as contractors have access to. Do we have anybody in the room with government credentials who can get into OMB Max? If any of you do, or if you have friends, it's fascinating to go in there and see all the data for every IT program, of which there are thousands, in terms of performance and expectations. It's amazing. Our government customers have to populate that in order for Congress to give them continued appropriation authority to keep spending money. So we should at least know what's in there that we can see. And those of you who have been to any of the market briefings that are going on concurrently right now, whether it's DoD or civilian, a lot of the data they pulls from a direct connect to the dashboard, to the OMB Max. Within Max, the colors of money are specified. How much for capital? How much for services? How much for R&D, if applicable? Line by line by line. So again, that's in the dashboard data. Unless your management get excited about how much your quota should be, because these numbers are big, 88 billion is a lot of money. Just remember, that's the total spend for that IT program. It includes all the government full-time equivalents or other people or all the other contractors working on that program. So when we get down to how much is for products as opposed to everything else, it's got to go through that pyramid that I showed you a couple slides ago. So now let's look at procurement drivers. I've been trying to make the point that everything in the government is based on law or executive orders, which have the effect of law. Everything has to track back to some authority. You can't just go do something because you think it's a good idea. It has to be based on something. So as we think about our selling process, our pipeline, our funnel, our marketing, we want to make sure that we're tagging into these requirements that are all based in law and then implemented in regulation. So getting thoroughly familiar with that based on whatever it is we're selling within whichever agency is a fundamental thing to be doing. And the IT requirements come from law, just like the procurement processes come from law. Now, laws take a long time to get passed, politics being what they are. And so a good idea, many of you might remember back when we were talking about getting to IPv6 as opposed to IPv4. We're going to run out of addresses. It took years. People thought it might be a light switch move like China can do. No. No, we take a long time for these things. We take a long time to adopt cybersecurity protocols, secure supply chain protocols. We take a long time to agree on standardizing on certain things because we don't want to shut down innovation. We want to maintain competition among many providers. And so the process of turning a new idea or a new technology into a mandate, which we all want, can take years. It's not just getting Congress to pass the law. It's actually getting it implemented in regulation. Implementing regulation is a whole nother process. And then once the rules are written, whether it's the federal acquisition regulations or whether it's the regulations in the Department of Defense, the DoD 5000 or the 7000 series, rules associated with finance, procurement, IT requirements, then we have to train the workforce. Oh, that takes a couple years. And so we as contractors, so the government actually relies on us as contractors to help spread the word. We will be more successful when we are ahead of the curve in terms of what's coming and why it's important, so that we can actually help educate the customer base. They don't have enough resources to do it, and it's in our advantage to do it, so we might as well just get on with it. Some of the law that relates to IT specifically, I mentioned GIPRA earlier. Cleaner-Cohen switched the government from buying mil-spec stuff to actually buying commercial items. It's been updated now with FTARA. We're already 5 years into FTARA. MGT, the idea of having revolving funds, about 2 years old now. Secure, just passed last year, this idea of providing bug bounties and secure supply chain protocols. We don't have the rules yet for that. The council is supposed to come up with the rules, the standards, the procedures, the best practices. And so one of the things we're talking about with partners at IMIX and also at Arrow is what are the standards that we would like to see, that we know are possible because of our global experience, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector, specific to IT, from chips to software to recycling hardware. That's a current issue for us. You want to be aware that it's coming, be on the lookout, because the law that was passed last December said the committee would have a proposed rule. They asked for an interim final, which means it's in effect by December of this year. Well, we're already in November, and none of us have heard what's going on. So it's time to start talking about this. So any of you that are wired into that, please talk to people at IMIX and Arrow and Troy, and let's be part of this conversation so that the rules that get written actually can work and can raise the bar. And because we're part of it, we'll be part of the new, higher way of operating. We'll be better positioned. The others mentioned there are actually implementations, programs based on statutes. FedRAMP is a program based on FSMA requirements for the cloud. Well, you get the idea. Our CIOs have to respond to all this law and then all the rules that implement it, and then all the programs that are supposed to reflect that authority to implement these great ideas. FTARA brought the CIOs up to the level of the CFO and the agency head to be making sure that agencies are spending in sensible ways for their enterprises. And while most CIOs don't have a lot of budget to actually spend, they have an incredible amount of influence and they can kill a deal in a heartbeat. And so we want to make sure that we're in sync with the initiatives that CIOs care about because they're implementing policy. Which is why I recommend becoming familiar with all the initiatives of the CIO Council at cio.gov. That's your source for that. Some of the laws that they have to address, FISMA for security, cybersecurity, those laws are updated all the time. The Secure Act, the Secure Supply Chain, actually amends provisions in FISMA. There's proposed legislation to have FedRAMP append FISMA for cloud. FISMA requires NIST to set the standards, requires agencies to report on all their systems back to Congress, the FISMA report card. So any of you in the cybersecurity space, at least make sure you're looking at the latest report card, FISMA report card, for your agency because that'll tell you where they are potentially deficient. Another act, MGT, Modernizing Government Technology Act. This is an idea that actually was part of FITARA, but then it didn't pass, and it came back as a separate standalone bill. The idea is if our agencies are going to start doing cloud-based shared services, whether it's a finance system or any other system that other agencies or sub-agencies can use as a service, can purchase as a service, setting that up is going to require some initial investment. The problem is, Congress, it's hard to get appropriation money, capital money, to set up such a service. So the idea with the MGT Act was that Congress would actually appropriate some money to a fund, a revolving fund, to set up infrastructure and systems that would then get paid for over time by selling the output as cloud or some kind of shared service. Congress funded it at like $250,000 the first year. They've been adding some money to it. Not a lot of money, but just want to make sure you understand the purpose behind this. It wasn't to just sell them something. It was to sell them things that could become part of an offering for a shared service so that as money comes in from that shared service, it goes back to the fund and can be used again to build additional services or upgrade the service. That's what the MGT Act is about. And the takeaway there talks about that. It's got to be a strong business case. It has to move the agency forward into the world of cloud computing, utility-based computing, shared services. That's the purpose behind it. Cleaner-Cohen and the E-Government Act, actually it was the E-Government Act, established the CIO position and the CIO Council, and we're now in the 4th permanent one, and we see an evolution of the kinds of legal requirements that the CIOs have tried to implement. Nothing is perfect. They're always maturing these agencies and departments toward architectures and business systems that are interoperable, current, so that we don't have all this redundancy that just in the end gets kind of old before it's time and costs too much. So that's law and regulation that drives IT procurement, sets requirements, explains why the government is buying what they do. Now let's talk a little bit about the acquisition process. So the rules of the road for acquisition also come from law. Every year in the National Defense Authorization Act, in Section 800, there's like close to 100 provisions that require the procurement community, the FAR Council and the defense equivalent of that, to implement in regulation. I just looked it up, I don't know, in the last day or two, and the current FAR cases and the DFAR cases, I mean, it's over 100 cases, changing particular clauses in the federal acquisition regulations based on legislation that was passed last year or years before. So we keep on top of this so that we know what's going on. And I used to always use the Air Force FAR site because it gave me all the supplementals, the DFARs, and all the agency supplements, of which there's more than 25. That's all been consolidated now. So I had to update the link. It's at acquisition.gov. GSA is managing it. It's good. Links right down to the clauses. It's good. What I want to do is walk through the acquisition process and then circle back to that slide that we started out with, the 3 chains of command. So according to the regulations, beginning in FAR Part 7, agencies are instructed, program managers are really instructed, to define a need and then go out to the marketplace and see what's available that would meet that need. And then once you see what's available commercially, you might adjust the need. Shopping around is always an educative process. We always learn more about our needs and wants. I know every time I go shopping I do, which is why I kind of stay away from that. Because I learn, oh, that's cool, now I need that. Same thing with the government. So as we are talking to our customers, we want to say, well, what stage of acquisition planning are you in? Are we doing market research right now? Are you guys doing market research? Hopefully the answer is yes, because that's when they can talk to us. The door is open to collect information. This is when they put out the sources sought notices. This is when they put out the request for information. The door is open because they are defining their needs and requirements. The need can be very general, and after market research, hopefully, the requirement is very precise based on educated shopping, educated market research. And all this is defined in the FAR. 7 for planning and Part 10 for market research. Writing requirements is Part 11. And then, once we know what our requirements are and we've done market research, we should have a pretty good idea what the price is going to be. We come up with our price estimate. And we go over to the funding people. Say, we're planning to do this. Done our market research. Here's what it's going to cost. How do we get the right amount of money in the right account? Remember that apportionment word? Key is the right amount of money in the right account. Because otherwise, the deal's going to blow up. And after the funding is set, then contracts can issue the solicitation. Whether it's a simple web purchase off a shopping system or a reverse auction, or whether it's an RFQ or an RFP or an IFB, they have many options based on what it is that they're buying. And all those options and paths are all described in the regulations, much of which are informed by the market research and what it is that they're buying. And then, of course, they continue through the process, negotiating, and ultimately awarding a contract or issuing an order. So that's the process. We want to understand where the money is, what the requirements should be or might be, so that we're talking to people in that 1, 2, or 3 step of the process. Because once the solicitation comes out, it's baked. And just to remind us again, it all starts with the people with the mission and the budget. The program office. Informed, in the case of IT, by the CIO. Program people have the money to spend. They have to make sure it lines up with the requirements, the policy requirements that the CIO's shop is thinking about. They have to go out and do that market research, do that independent government cost estimate, structure up a procurement request showing which account they want to pull the money from, which appropriation they want to tap, And then finance makes sure that that is a legitimate use for that money. Sign off. And then we start steps 5 through 8 on the wheel. All this is carefully baked in law and regulation. This is how it is. So we want to make sure we're really familiar with the rules that are being tweaked. And part of the reason why I mention this now is because some of you know that there's been a lot of procurement reform coming out of DoD that will extend throughout all of federal. Over the last 3 years, there have been working groups that were statutorily put in place to get rid of old rules that no longer are applicable, make procurement reform changes. And so for the last 3 years, we've had a lot of statutory change. Most of it has not been implemented. So we're going to see a lot of rulemaking for this year and next year. So we want to keep up to date on that because it is the rules that a contracting officer follows. It can be law, but if it's not yet implemented, they don't follow it. So understanding when the rule becomes effective is the world we live in. Yeah.
So the sources, how does this model fit into your 8 steps? So do I have to find out about whether or not a comptroller has funding available to do my sources sought and market research?
Good questions. So the program office does those first 3 steps: need, research, defining the requirements, figuring out what it's going to cost before they go to the controller. They might be telling them, hey, we're thinking about this, and this is the range. This might be the high, this might be the low. We're still working on it. Just want to give you a heads up. It's really shrewd to run some of this stuff in parallel so that the controller's office is apportioning the money, so the money's already in the right account, even before we totally lock down our requirements. So, does that answer the question? Is that 1 through 3 are over on the far left. Number 4 is in the middle, and everything else is contracts.
Since I have before, I'll ask another one.
And then we'll go to the person right behind you.
So we've seen a lot of the discussion today, and just in my own personal sales, there's quite a bit of software as a service, cloud initiatives, and consumption modeling, which has a very disruptive effect on traditional procurement. Are you seeing any changes in procurement that allows for a swifter, more efficient means of dealing with consumption modeling?
Well, the reason that we don't have swift, cookie-cutter ways of doing this is because it's still pretty new. So we don't have rules in the FAR that specifically pertain to it. We have a few clauses here and there. We have some contracting officers who are exercising, making judgments on how to do this. We have, from the sell side, people who are packaging things up so that look more like widgets than actually as a service. So if it's this for a price and runs for 12 months, it kind of looks like maintenance, which they've already been buying. So the sell side and the buy side has been evolving in how it positions things in light of the existing rules. That said, rules are underway to try to start baking this into the federal acquisition regulations. But the cookie cutter approach always lags the early stages and the early adopters, because the rule writers don't want to put the rules in place until they know with certainty that this is how it is. The FAR is the cookbook that is the repeatable, predictable process. It's the mature business process. Hopefully it's in place for when the market is in its growth phase. Sadly, it's often not in place until we're halfway through the growth phase and we're heading toward maturity. Yes?
Is there any official portal where program managers post their RFIs to do their market research so that we can sort of sense the needs and get in touch with them earlier?
Sure. So many times, they really don't want the whole world to see because that's just going to clog up their inbox. The way they are supposed to do it generally for full and open competition is post it at fbo.gov. The Federal Business, what's FBO stand for? Fed Biz Ops, right? Oh, it doesn't? What do we call it now? What is the? Beta dot. Oh, SAM. So SAM has been in the works for a long, long time. Yeah, okay, so it's under SAM, but it's still beta. Well, thank you. Yeah, awesome. I also noticed that there is another framework in DoD. I wrote it down, but I can't remember it. Anybody know the enterprise? Enterprise is in the word for DoD. So these sites are changing, but that's where these things get posted. What often happens is they will post it within a portal of a particular contract vehicle to limit the visibility to a handful of contractors they trust and they know have it on the vehicle, right? So you want to work with a partner who has the vehicle because a lot of times, and you want to talk to your customer about where they're posting this stuff. Good question.
So between the last slide and this current slide, where do OTAs fall into that process? Because we learned about those in the opening session.
So other transaction authority has existed for a long time. It's gotten a lot of traction. It is given to the head of an agency for buying things outside of the normal federal acquisition regulations, outside of this process, outside of the FAR. And some people say, yay, no rules. Well, wait a minute. We have to get to a contract. We have to get to a contract. Writing a contract from scratch is pretty hard. So OTA authority has always existed for bleeding edge activity. All right? Not commodities, not commercial items. It's being used occasionally now for that, but you just need to know that OTA is not a predictable, repeatable, scalable process. It's the one-off deal for an agency that has enough juice with the SecDef or the Secretary of DHS to actually get a signature. Everybody? On a vehicle, but it's usually for leading edge research, for which they don't even have time to do grant proposals. It's like, oh, something blew up in Afghanistan, and we need, and such a consulting firm was in here last week, and we want to get them on the job tomorrow. It's not for commercial items, even though it occasionally is being pulled in as part of those engagements. Yeah, good question. Thank you. So we have to wrap up here. I just want to remind everybody that there are seasons throughout the year. We're in a particularly slow spot right now because we're under CR. Not supposed to do anything new. Now's the time to go talk to them about next year, what they're going to be putting in their 2021 plans, as well as what they're planning for 2020 once they get full appropriation authority. Because at the 6-month mark, the end of March, they want to try to almost have half their money spent. So things get queued up. It's a mini use it or lose it kind of situation. So if your customer has juice and really knows what they are ready and they have all the plumbing done, they've gone around the wheel, a lot of things can happen in this spring time frame. And then, of course, we have the end of the year. A mature organization has a few people that are looking 3 years out. Because I talked about 2021, we should be thinking about 2022 very soon as well, if we're really leading edge We have roadmaps. We want to talk about capabilities. Okay, that's it. We came in on time. Are we done? Are we out of time? Well, thank you. Okay, my pleasure.